So in this video, I'm going to talk about reciprocity. Reciprocity, very serious sounding word. At least it sounds kind of serious to me. So rather than explain it, what the word means in the context of photography, I think I'll just show you. And if I show you a couple of examples, then I think you'll kind of understand why it's called reciprocity in the first place. So let's just assume we have a light meter and we're photographing maybe a portrait indoors or outdoors, who knows, and we turn our light meter on, we punch in the ISO 100, and we hit the button and it meters the scene and it figures out the exposure value and shows us a shutter speed and an aperture that would work. So in this case, it's showing us f8 at 1/250th at ISO 100. Okay, that works. So we want to punch that into our camera and everything's wonderful. Well, what I've done here is I put together this little table. And there is the settings that we just got. f8 at 1/250th. Well, remember that chart with all the list of f-stops and shutter speeds and all that? We could take those values and we could fill in these tables. So what would be the next aperture here? And what would be the next aperture there? Let's look at all the different apertures. So I'm just going to jump ahead to, and I'm just going to turn that off because that's annoying. So what I've done here is I filled in, what's the next aperture after 8? 11. Next one after that is 16 and 22 and so on and so forth. And I've done the same thing that way. I've done the same thing with the shutter speeds. Gone 1/25th, 1/60th, 1/500th, and so on and so forth. So what is this showing us? This is illustrating to us that any one of these combinations will actually give us a good exposure. Let me just back up to that. Like if you think about it, if you went from f8 to f11, that hole would be smaller, the picture would get darker. But if we slow down the shutter speed by 1 stop, the picture would get brighter again, so it'd be back to normal. Something to think about. Let's just go to the next slide. It'll start to make sense. So let's say we go to a different location. Maybe we've moved from outdoors to indoors, or we went from the sun to the shade, and we take another light meter reading. So now the numbers are different. We have f8 at 1/30th, ISO 100. Okay, so we punch that into our table. And again, I fill in the blanks again with all the other apertures and shutter speeds. So for this location, we have a whole different set of combinations that will work. So people always ask me, well, what should my settings be? Well, it depends where you are. Different locations will give you different settings. But what I'm trying to show you here is, here are 2 different locations, and each location has its own set of combinations that will work. Interesting. So what is this concept of reciprocity? How does it fit in here? Well, here's a definition I'll give you. The relationship between the intensity of the light and duration of the exposure that will result in identical exposure. So I'll just let you look at that and absorb that a little bit. It's a lot of words there. And if you're like me, maybe you're feeling a little bit like, what? I don't quite get that. So when we talk about the word reciprocity, it usually means balance. When we say reciprocal relationship, that means I'm doing something for you and you're doing something for me. Think about balance on a scale. If you take the weight off of one side, you're going to be out of balance. So you got to take the weight off something else to keep everything in balance. So that's what the concept of reciprocity is all about. So if you were to change one exposure setting, well, then now you've got to change something else. So let's just take a look at this example here. What if you took your light meter and this is what you got, f8 at 1/30th? Okay, that's what your light meter said. You took a picture and the exposure was good. Great. Only problem is, maybe you don't want to use 1/30th. Maybe you find 1/30th of a second, you can't hold it still. 1/30th is not going to work for you. So instead, you want to use a shutter speed of 1/60th of a second. Okay. So here's my question. What would happen if we changed our shutter speed to a 60th? Well, our picture would get darker because we just speeded up the shutter speed. The time is less light's coming in. So what must my aperture be in order to keep the same exposure? So this gave me a good exposure for whatever scene I'm in. Doing this is going to make my picture darker. We got to do something else. So I'm just going to walk you through the steps here. If we were to take all these words and simplify it, what I'm asking you is, if this is a setting that works, and I want to keep that same exposure, then I need to fill in this blank. If I switch to 1/60th, I've got to change my aperture. And what should that aperture be? So I'm going to take these numbers and I'm going to drop them into that chart, similar to what we were looking at earlier. So there's our f8 and there's our 1/30th. And I've arranged these numbers so that as the numbers go that way, the image would get darker. And as our numbers go this way, our images would get brighter. The aperture's getting bigger, the time's getting slower. Aperture's getting smaller, the time's getting shorter. So darker, brighter. I've just set it up that way just to illustrate something to you. So there's our f8 and there's our 30th. Okay? Well, what we're doing here is we're taking our 30th of a second and we're going to a 60th. Great. So I've got a question here. What happens when we do this? Well, our photo is going to get darker. How much darker? Well, going from a 30th to a 60th is a stop. Remember I said it was time you got to start memorizing your shutter speeds and f-stops? So just looking at that, I know that's a stop. Our picture will be one stop too dark. So what we could do to solve that problem is take our aperture and let's open it by one stop. So going from f8 to 5.6, we opened up our aperture by one stop. So now our picture is back to its original brightness. Does that make sense? I'm going to go back to this slide. We changed our shutter speed to a 60th. The time is shorter. Less light's coming in. Our picture gets darker. We have to compensate for that. In order to maintain reciprocity, we have to do a counter action. So we did one thing that made the picture darker, so now we got to do something else that's going to make it brighter again, so it's back to our original exposure, our original brightness. So the only thing we can do is we have to change our aperture. So by opening our aperture, we're letting in more light. How much do I change the aperture? Well, I change it by one stop because I moved the other one by one stop. So 5.6 would be the answer. You will have questions like this on the midterm and on the final exam. So make sure you can, you might have to watch this video a couple of times, and I'm going to show you another example in a second. But make sure you understand how this works. So let's say, here's another example. You're photographing a person while they're walking. And you're saying, okay, walk across the sidewalk and I'll take your picture. And so you take a light meter reading, and this is the setting that your camera gives you, f16 at a 60th. Okay. However, so this will give you a good exposure. It'll be the correct brightness. They're moving. If you take their picture, they're going to be blurry because a 60th of a second is not a fast enough shutter speed to freeze the action of somebody moving. So maybe you decide you want to use 2/50th of a second. So 1/60th of a second, the person's blurry. 1/250th, you're going to be able to freeze that motion. So you want to use a 2/50th. The question is, what changes are necessary to keep the exposure the same? So I've taken that question and I turned it into the same format as of our previous question. f16, 1/60th is what we started with. but we want to change it to 1/250th because we want to freeze the action. So 16, 1/60th. I've taken those values and I moved them down there. If we want to go to a 2/50th, well, that's 2 stops. What's going to happen to our picture? I'll ask you that question again. What happens when we do this? Our picture is going to be too dark. The time has gotten shorter. Less light is coming into the camera. How much less light? 2 stops less light. That's a big change. That's very dark. That's very noticeable. So it's okay to use 2/50th. We will freeze the action, but our picture will be too dark. So we have to do a reciprocal action. We have to do something to our aperture that's going to make our picture brighter. So we're going to have to open up our aperture. How much? Well, we moved this one by 2 stops, so we'll have to move the other one by 2 stops as well. So instead of f16, we're now going to have to use f8. And that would be the answer to that question. So you can expect on the test a question like this, where I'm going to describe to you a scenario where you are, have a certain light meter reading and a certain camera setting that works. But what if you change that camera setting? Maybe you change the shutter speed of the aperture. What would be the other setting that you would have to change? And how much would you change it? There's going to be times when you're going to say, hey, I want to go to 2/50th, and I don't want f8. I want to stick with f16. So I want this. I want 2/50th, and I want f16. What can you do? Well, that's a question for you. What can you do? And the answer is you can change the ISO. So remember, it's an exposure triangle. There are 3 components that control the brightness of your image. So the other thing you can do is change the ISO. So now I've taken our chart here, our table, and I've included ISO. And so there's our value. Our values, well, ISO 100, f16, 1/60th. Those are our settings. Boom, boom, boom. However, we want to use 2/50th. So we are going to go here and go to 2/50th. And earlier, we moved our aperture to f8, but we don't want to use f8. We want to use f16. So what can we do? We can adjust our ISO. And if this is going to make our picture brighter, we need to pick an ISO that's going to make our pictures brighter. How much brighter? 2 stops. So we have to go from 100 to 200, 200 to 400. Whew! That's a lot. That's a complicated topic to discuss. And some of you will get this, and maybe some of you doing photography already, you get it. Some of you, especially those of you who are new to photography, this is just going to blow your mind. This is going to be a lot to take in. So you might have to watch this video a few times. You might have to do a couple of practice runs, maybe get out some scrap paper, I don't know, whatever it takes. Talk to it, get a tutor if you have to. Talk to some second-year students and have them explain it to you. And if none of those things work, make an appointment with me and I'll go over how all this works. And sometimes it's a little bit easier when you're holding an actual lens or a camera in your hand. I have a document on Fanshawe Online that you can download. And this is just like a practice sheet. And it's got all kinds of questions to prepare you for our first midterm. And it's got different scenarios where we're changing the aperture and the shutter speed. And I also have an answer sheet that goes along with that. Just something for you to practice with. Anyways, there you have it. That concludes week 2. We've talked about light meters and how they work, and we've talked about reciprocity. Okay, that's all for now.